Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're taking a close look at the views of Baron Van Til. He's a former Dutch judge.
Right, and the source is a YouTube transcript from The Truman Show.
Our mission really is to pull out his main arguments, his concerns about, well, the law today and where things might be heading globally.
And Judge Van Til, he's got quite a specific background. About 15 years as a judge in Rotterdam.
Right, handling commercial and civil law.
Yeah, specifically insolvency, dissolutions, that sort of thing. He also wrote a book, The Fourth Tyranny.
And he's known for being, I think, the only former Dutch judge who publicly pushed back against the COVID-19 policies.
That's right, quite unique. And before being a judge, he was a lawyer and arbitrator. Even lectured at Erasmus University on international trade law.
Interesting mix. Law, trade.
Yeah, and he mentions this interesting detail, being a Catholic working in a Jewish trading company, building trust there. Apparently his business sense was why they invited him to be a deputy judge. Helped him handle all those Rotterdam insolvency cases without needing, tons of extra training.
So you have this judge, grounded in law, but also in, like, the real world of international trade. And he's developed some pretty strong concerns.
Very strong. He basically says the rule of law is destroyed. That's his word.
Destroyed. Wow. And he thinks powerful groups are behind it.
Exactly. He argues they benefit from this erosion, even mentioning figures like David Rockefeller and their stated agendas. He's also worried about the knowledge level of, well, many MPs.
Okay, and then there's this really serious claim he makes. We need to be clear here. We're just reporting what he said in the source, definitely not confirming it.
Right, it's a heavy accusation.
He claims numerous labor parliamentarians were convicted of pedophilia. And he connects this to a belief that, what prominent Dutch politicians are saying is false, that they're influenced by people like Klaus Schwab, the WPF.
It's a lot to unpack there. He also strongly supports the idea of citizens being armed.
And he links the "you will own nothing and be happy" idea directly to the end of property rights.
And human rights, in his view. It all ties together for him, this perceived attack on individual freedom and ownership.
It's quite a stark warning he's sounding. The idea of powerful forces deliberately weakening the system.
Yeah, and his call for arming the population, that clearly comes from a deep fear of losing control, losing autonomy. Again, when he makes claims like the one about the parliamentarians, it's crucial for you, the listener, to remember we're presenting his perspective from the source.
Okay, so this feeling that the justice system is broken, it leads him to look for, I guess, counterforces, which brings us to Donald Trump.
Right. He sees Trump's election as a wonder.
A wonder.
Because he thought it was so unlikely, given the media opposition, the money behind his opponent. He saw it as potential help for Europe, too.
And then there's the issue of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs.
Yes. He calls Trump's reported blocking of CBDCs in the U.S. a second wonder. He thinks this is absolutely crucial for humanity.
Why crucial? What's the danger he sees?
Enslavement, basically. Control through QR codes. He imagines scenarios where your access to your own money could be limited based on government rules or WHO directives.
Especially with this new pandemic treaty he mentions.
Exactly. He links those two. And he notes that most people aren't really aware of what CBDCs fully entail.
He even suggests Europeans might start opening dollar accounts.
Yeah, which would obviously hit the euro. He also brings up Trump supposedly pulling the U.S. out of the WHO, not signing the pandemic treaty, limiting that WHO influence over people via QR codes.
Though he admits that might leave Europe more exposed.
Right. He acknowledges these actions aren't guaranteed. They still face hurdles.
What's really striking is how central CBDCs are to his fears. He sees them as this major threat to financial freedom.
Which he ties directly to basic human rights. And his view of Trump's actions really has to be seen through that lens, resisting this specific perceived threat. The idea about Europeans moving to dollars is, well, an interesting side point he makes about the global ripple effects.
Okay, so how did he get here? How did this former judge develop these quite intense concerns?
Well, he says it started way back during his career in international trade. He observed, quote, remarkable things happening in the EU that were not right.
Like what?
He gives the example of Helmut Kohl's promises about the euro versus how the European Central Bank's debts actually ballooned.
Ah, the stability pact thing, keeping debt below 60% of GDP.
Exactly. He points out that back in 2015, only Germany and the Netherlands were actually sticking to it. Italy, Greece, Belgium, way over the limit.
So early signs of things not working as promised.
Right. And he even mentions a time he successfully sued the EU, well, the EEC back then, over too much bureaucracy with protein imports. The skimmed milk powder case, he calls it.
Okay, so he was challenging bureaucracy early on.
Yeah, it supports his long-held belief.
Right.
The biggest threat to trade isn't competition, it's government red tape, bureaucracy. He even draws parallels way back to the 13th century Amsterdam grain trade and how export taxes interfered then. A historical pattern, he argues.
So his skepticism towards these big, overarching structures, it's not new. It comes from his actual experience.
Exactly. Grounded in his work, his view of economic history, that milk powder case is a concrete example of him pushing back. The history bits are there to show this isn't a new problem, this government interference.
Okay, so let's get into the core of his argument about the destroyed rule of law. He has 5 pillars, right?
Yes, 5 essential elements he believes have been undermined. First, and he says this is the most important, freedom as a human right. But he's specific. He sees it as an Enlightenment idea, different from Roman libertas, where slavery existed, or Christian freedom, which he links to the kingdom of God, not an inherent right like this.
Interesting distinction. Americans often put free speech first, he notes.
Right, but he follows the French order, putting freedom itself first. Second pillar, property rights.
Okay.
Third, security, or schut, meaning little certainty, safety.
Makes sense.
Fourth, resistance against tyranny. He thinks this one might become very important. And fifth is a list. Freedom of expression, religion, correspondence, association, assembly, petition, and bodily integrity. He specifically notes bodily integrity has been under huge pressure recently.
And he believes all these fundamental rights are being squeezed.
That's his core assertion. They're all under significant pressure.
It's quite a framework, grounding the rule of law in these specific rights, with freedom at the top.
Yes, and his historical points clarify what he means by freedom as a human right. By listing these 5, he sets up the standard he's judging the current situation against and finding it lacking. And including resistance against tyranny really shows how deep his concerns go.
Okay, so building on those pillars, he talks about other things needed for a functioning Rechtsstaat, that's the term, right? Rule of law state.
Exactly. Rechtsstaat is maybe broader than just the rights. It includes the government structure, too. So first, he stresses the separation of religion and state.
Why is that so crucial for him?
He brings up the Inquisition, Sharia law's death penalty for apostasy. Basically, he wants to prevent anyone claiming to speak for God from getting political power. History's warning for him.
Got it. What else?
Then, the trias politica separation of powers. Montesquieu's idea.
Executive, legislative, judicial.
The checks and balances. Right. Like a 3-legged stool, all need to be separate and strong to keep things balanced, prevent tyranny. He contrasts it with absolute monarchies, notes even ancient China didn't develop this. He even mentions the church condemned Montesquieu back then.
And he thinks this separation is breaking down now.
Yeah, diluted, broken. Then he emphasizes the rule of law itself, meaning everyone's equal before the law. Government, powerful people, everyone has to obey.
How does he define that further?
Things like honoring treaties, no retroactive taxes, freedom of contract, getting past old guild restrictions. He distinguishes this specific principle from the broader Rechtsstaat.
Okay, and the last aspect.
Entrepreneurial production, market economy with a social safety net, based on Adam Smith. Prosperity needs entrepreneurs, he argues.
But he acknowledges powerful families, corporations could distort that.
Yes, through corruption or government giving big companies advantages. He mentions cartel laws meant to stop monopolies seem to have failed, pointing to media ownership in the Netherlands, just 2 Belgian families owning most newspapers.
He's very critical of the media, isn't he?
Extremely. He accuses mainstream media of failing its basic duties like hearing both sides, due diligence, acting as a watchdog. Compares it to North Korean propaganda.
Strong words. Does he give examples?
He mentions a minister using climate data only from after 1820, ignoring the medieval warm period with little media challenge.
So what's his solution for the media?
Cut off state funding. Cut off NGO and foreign funding like from Soros or Gates. Demand transparent ownership. Maybe even criminal prosecution for journalistic failures.
Wow. He also mentioned the Dutch broadcaster VPRO leaving X.
Yeah, because Musk might be linked to Trump. He sees that as hypocritical since VPRO itself is state-funded.
So he lays out this detailed picture of what a healthy rule of law state should look like.
And then argues we're moving away from it. He stresses the structural elements, separation of powers, independent courts just as much as the individual rights, and the media's role in holding power accountable is clearly a huge issue for him. His background in trade definitely shapes his views on the economy.
Okay, so let's list them. He has 8 specific points he believes show this squandering of the Rechtsstaat. What's number 1?
1, central bank digital currency. We talked about that.
Right.
2, the new pandemic treaty from the WHO.
Okay.
3, what he calls the recalibration, but sees as abolition of human rights. He links this to W.E.S. Schwab's Great Reset book, where he says human rights are missing and that "own nothing, be happy" line. He also mentions Yuval Noah Harari calling human rights fiction.
That's a lot under point 3. Number 4.
The Great Reset itself, which he flat out calls an attempt to establish a Marxist world regime.
Okay.
5, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. He argues achieving them requires giving up rights, accepting a global dictatorship. Mentions 15-minute cities, destroying Western agriculture, centralizing food production, points out Bill Gates becoming the biggest U.S. farmland owner.
Next.
Censorship specifically, censorship done in the name of fighting disinformation or misinformation. He argues free speech must include the right to be wrong, using Galileo being suppressed by the church as his example.
Interesting historical parallel. 7.
7, the rotting of the judiciary. He cites a specific Dutch prosecution, Gideon van Meyeren, and a magazine article.
And finally, 8.
8, government policy on climate and health, specifically COVID. He references a New York court ruling that reinstated unvaccinated firefighters, saying the injection didn't stop illness or spread. And he mentions a Pfizer exec admitting in the EU Parliament that they hadn't tested for transmission prevention before the rollout.
Okay, so those 8 points really cover a huge range, don't they? Finance, health, speech, judiciary.
Yeah, and he sees them as interconnected. Not isolated issues, but all part of this bigger trend weakening individual liberty and the rule of law as he defines it. Using specific court cases or admissions gives his arguments a kind of factual anchor, at least from his perspective.
So looking ahead, he considers some potential future state systems and finds 4 particularly worrying. What's the first?
A Marxist world regime. Like Schwab's Great Reset, he says. He compares it to the Soviet Union, North Korea. He even sarcastically suggests splitting the Netherlands into Marxist zones. He also criticizes Rudolf Steiner's idea about entrepreneurs not owning production means.
Okay, that's one grim scenario. Second.
Autonomous land. Basically, anarchy. No government, everyone does their own thing.
Sounds chaotic.
He thinks so too. High risk of kidnapping, slavery. You'd need violence to solve anything. He references Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau on why we need a state monopoly on violence. But he also brings up Hugo de Groot, who said if the government becomes tyrannical, citizens regain the right to defend themselves. Still, he sees autonomy as a huge risk overall.
Third, potential bad future.
Experiment.
Yeah.
Just throwing out the old ways, trying anything. He thinks this, like autonomy, just leads to civil war. Maybe try it on an island first, he suggests dryly.
And the fourth.
Power transfer to artificial intelligence robots. This is the theory from someone called Bob DeWitt.
AI running thing.
Yeah. DeWitt apparently suggests robots might be smarter, more neutral. But the judge sees this as very close to Schwab's Great Reset, just swap experts for robots.
What are his worries about AI rule?
Surveillance, who programs the robots, the lack of human feeling, instinct, morality. Can AI self-correct? He insists human rights are essential and shouldn't be ditched for AI. If tried, it should be limited time, area with an escape route if the AI goes rogue. He connects this to current AI developments and Musk's Neuralink implanting chips.
So these 4 futures, they all represent for him a loss of the central human control and established principles.
Exactly. He's deeply skeptical of any radical break from the kind of rule of law principles he outlined earlier. He fears these paths undermine human agency and rights.
He then circles back to the WHO and the pandemic treaty. What more does he add?
He doubles down, saying it grants the WHO immense power over global health. He cites a Swiss lawyer, Philip Kruse, who argued in the EU Parliament that the treaty essentially aims to put the WHO above national law, making it the highest authority on earth.
And he points fingers at who holds the real power there.
Bill Gates. Because of his massive private funding, he argues Gates is effectively more powerful than the official Secretary General, Tedros, whom he notes isn't a medical doctor, and neither is Gates. He criticizes Dutch Kids News for portraying Tedros positively.
So the fear is unchecked power for the WHO.
Yes. Unchecked power to mandate things like vaccinations, potentially with experimental or harmful substances. He points to how similar COVID measures rolled out globally, regardless of local situations, as a preview of this kind of centralized power. He sees the treaty as codifying that, without accountability or separation of powers, a direct attack on the rule of law. And, he notes, the mainstream media is largely silent. This really encapsulates his fears about losing national control to global bodies that aren't democratically accountable, doesn't it?
It does. He sees it as a major step towards centralized global rule, bypassing national checks and balances, especially dangerous in health matters.
So, faced with these grim scenarios and threats, does he offer an alternative?
Yes, he proposes a fifth option, a revised constitution for a national democratic rule of law, basically creating a republic.
Okay, what are the key features of this republic?
First, end the monarchy. He argues the Dutch royals failed to protect the nation from this global agenda, so they've forfeited their place.
Strong stance. Second,
Focus on the national state, not the UN version of nations. He rejects the idea that nation-states caused the world wars.
how does he argue that?
He says WWII was imperialistic Germany wanting Lebensraum and oil. WWI started when Germany broke Belgium's neutrality. So abandoning the rule of law caused the wars, not the nation-state itself. He thinks nations want defense, not war, but powerful elites, Rothschilds, etc., profit from wars by funding both sides. So less international entanglement.
Definitely. He criticizes being bound to the EU, NATO, WHO, WEF, UN, says they don't serve ordinary people and let powerful figures operate without checks. He calls for an immediate Dutch exit from the EU using Article 50.
Next it. Okay, third feature of this republic.
A clear constitutional definition of the rule of law based on his 5 pillars. He says people don't even understand what Rechtsstaat means anymore. And critically, judges should be elected by the people for fixed terms, maybe 6 years, like in the US, not appointed by government.
And the Constitution's role.
It must be the highest law. He argues currently it isn't in the Netherlands because of Articles 93 and 94, which let international decisions override it. He wants those gone, calls parliamentarians who voted for them not compos mentis.
What about Article 120?
That prevents judges reviewing if laws conflict with the Constitution. He wants that gone, too. Basically, all judges must rule based directly on the Constitution as supreme law. No need for a separate constitutional court, then.
Right. Fourth feature.
Executive power. A presidential system, but with powers clearly limited in the Constitution. Short term, maybe 3 years. Fewer ministries. A referendum as a counterpower. And, again, elected judges. The mainstream media force it to function properly by cutting state and NGO foreign funding. He believes the market will then incentivize them to do their job, challenge power, hear both sides.
And sixth.
Democracy, but strengthened by a powerful Swiss-style referendum. Let the people directly influence the government's agenda. He feels parliamentary democracy has lost trust.
Does he think change can come from Parliament?
He seems skeptical. He mentions someone else's work on alternative systems, but points to Argentina Milei's executive actions cutting spending, balancing the budget as change coming from the top, not parliament. He acknowledges the U.S. direct elections, but also the deep state influence.
So he still sees figures like Trump as potential change agents?
Yes, especially on CBDCs, WHO, maybe income tax. Though he says Robert Kennedy Jr. is more trusted on health, he's very critical of Musk, particularly Neuralink and electric cars.
In Europe's role?
He thinks the richest European families are key. Will they follow potential U.S. shifts away from globalism? Maybe, because it serves their financial interests better. He circles back to AI being like the Great Reset, lacking humanity, and the WHO treaty lacking ways to correct course. This fifth option is really his blueprint for rebuilding, isn't it? National sovereignty, strong constitution, direct democracy, accountable judiciary.
Yeah, a very specific vision. And he uses some specific Dutch examples to illustrate his points further, right?
He does. He mentions the Dutch parliament voting against a fleet law in 1935, having a weak defense policy, broken rifle, before Hitler invaded, even though the country was rich. He criticizes how the dividend tax was handled, bad calculations, double taxation, discriminating against equity investment, he argues.
He also mentions the ING bailout.
Yes, in 2008, as an example of why having strong equity is important for banks.
And a controversial point about the donor law.
Very. He talks about the Dutch organ donor law, sharing a story about a young woman, Esme Venstra, who supposedly regained consciousness after her parents agreed to donation, claiming she was aware during the process. He criticizes the automatic donor status and alleges things are injected into brain-dead patients to stop reactions without anesthesia. Again, his claims reported here.
He also feels Parliament's rights are ignored.
Yeah, Article 68, the right to question government. He says it's violated regarding things like Bilderberg meetings. He points to the referendum on Ukraine being ignored, the EU constitution getting pushed through under a new name after being rejected, a state secretary okaying EU work on CBDCs against Parliament's wishes. All signs, for him, that things are seriously wrong.
And he thinks change only happens if people accept the truth about these issues.
That seems to be his view, yes.
So what does he see as his role now? What action is he taking?
Primarily writing and getting information out there. He hopes presenting the facts as he sees them will resonate. He acknowledges others might communicate differently. He mentions facing pushback, social exclusion for his views.
And he stresses the difference between democracy and the rule of law.
Absolutely. He insists rights aren't just democratic values you can vote away by majority. He uses an anecdote about Putin questioning Herman Van Rompuy's electoral legitimacy to highlight this difference. For him, at his age, providing this information is the most crucial thing he can do.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. Summarizing this deep dive into the former judge's perspective, what are the main takeaways?
Well, we've definitely heard his profound concerns about what he sees as the erosion, even destruction of the rule of law. Tied to that is the rise of global governance structures, the dangers he perceives in digital currencies like CBDCs, and serious threats to individual rights.
Yeah, and his analysis, while clearly, his specific viewpoint, it draws heavily on his legal background, his trade experience, and his interpretation of history and current events.
It's definitely strongly opinionated, but he builds a case based on those elements.
He leaves us with a pretty stark warning, doesn't he, about where things might be heading. His call for a whole new constitution, a return to certain fundamentals, rule of law, national sovereignty. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. It pushes you to ask, what are the essential safeguards for liberty and justice today in this super interconnected world?
And how can we, as citizens, actually ensure governments, national and international ones, are transparent and accountable? Big questions.
Huge questions. And remember, this deep dive presented one specific perspective based on the source material we had.
Right. We absolutely encourage you to dig deeper yourself. Research the topics that people mentioned: Schwab, Harari, Gates, the WHO treaty, CBDCs.
Explore different viewpoints. There are many arguments for and against digital currencies, different takes on national sovereignty versus global cooperation. Form your own conclusions.
So what stood out most to you from this discussion? What questions are still lingering?
It's worth reflecting on. This is definitely just scratching the surface of some really complex and important challenges.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.